It is 3:17 in the morning, and Sophia is standing in her kitchen in Zurich. Not because she cannot sleep, but because sleeping would mean surrendering to a silence she does not know how to inhabit anymore. The kitchen is immaculate. Bull-top cabinetry, Calacatta marble, a view across the lake that her colleagues once called the most beautiful office in Switzerland. She earned this, every surface of it, and yet her hand is hovering above her phone, and the question she has typed and deleted 4 times in the last 11 minutes is not about a client, not about a merger, not about the board. The question is, why? With everything I built, does it feel like I am standing on the outside of my own life? What Sophia does not know, what no one told her, not her MBA program, not her mentor, not the 17-hour flight she took to close the deal that made her CFO at 41, is that this feeling has a name, and the name is not burnout, and it is not ingratitude, and it is most certainly not weakness. It is called subconscious wealth reprogramming neuroscience, or rather, the precise and catastrophic absence of it, the lived consequence of a scarcity mindset so deeply encoded into the architecture of her nervous system that no salary, no title, no view across the Zurich Sea was ever going to touch it. Carl Jung called it the shadow, not the darkness you fear, but the one you have learned with tremendous sophistication and effort not to look at. And this, right here in this kitchen at 3:17 a.m., this is where we begin, now at the beginning of Sophia's story, at its most honest moment. Let us stay with Sophia for a moment, because she is not a cautionary tale, and she is not a failure. She is, in fact, precisely what the system was designed to produce, a person of extraordinary competence, locked inside an identity she assembled before she understood what identity was. At age 9, in a modest flat in Basel, Sophia watched her father count coins on a kitchen table, not because they were destitute, they were not, but because money in that household was always spoken of in the language of threat, of scarcity, of what we cannot afford to lose. And the brain of a 9-year-old, according to research published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, is not a passive receiver of information. It is a frequency-tuning instrument, calibrating itself to the emotional field of its primary caregivers with precision that would make any engineer weep. What Sophia's nervous system encoded that evening at the kitchen table was not the fact of coins. It was a feeling beneath the coins, that abundance is fragile, that safety is temporary, that the only rational response to the world is vigilance. Perpetual, exhausting, cortisol-soaked vigilance. Carl Jung, in his work on the architecture of the psyche, described 2 structures that most of us confuse for one: the persona, the identity we construct for the world, polished and purposeful and entirely strategic, and the shadow, the unexamined counterweight, the sum of everything we decided very early was too dangerous or too painful to integrate. Sophia's persona is CFO. Sophia's shadow is the girl counting coins. And here is a mechanism that Jung understood with almost unbearable clarity. The shadow does not disappear when the persona succeeds. It grows in proportion to it. Every promotion, every acquisition, every performance review that confirmed her excellence simultaneously fed a deeper, older, underground terror that she does not fundamentally deserve to be here, and that the moment she stops performing at this velocity, the coins will return to the table. This is what the Carl Jung shadow money archetype looks like when it is wearing an Hermes scarf and chairing a board meeting. It looks exactly like success. It sounds exactly like confidence. And it feels, at 3:17 in the morning, exactly like the ground dissolving beneath your feet. Wallace D. Wattles wrote The Science of Getting Rich in 1910, and he wrote it with the kind of structural clarity that the self-help industry has spent a century successfully obscuring. His central argument was not motivational. It was architectural. He identified 2 fundamentally different modes of economic engagement, what he called the competitive plane and the creative plane, and he argued with remarkable precision that virtually every educated, high-performing professional in the Western world is operating exclusively from the first. The competitive plane is a logic of scarcity made into a career. It says, there's a finite amount of wealth, of recognition, of safety, and your task is to secure more of it than the person beside you. It produces extraordinary performers. It produces Sophia. And it produces, with the same inexorable reliability, the well-paid slave syndrome, a condition in which the architecture of your professional life is indistinguishable from the architecture of your deepest childhood fear, only with better furniture. Wattles called the alternative the creative plane, not creativity in the artistic sense, but in the generative sense, the mode of operating from abundance as a premise, rather than arriving at it as a destination. The distinction sounds philosophical. It is, in fact, neurological. And we will return to the neuroscience of it when we understand what Sophia's subconscious wealth reprogramming actually requires. But first, we need to follow the money, and the money, as it always does, leads us somewhere older and darker than a kitchen table in Basel. In 1903, a man named Frederick T. Gates wrote a memorandum on behalf of the General Education Board, funded by John D. Rockefeller, that contained a sentence so candid in its intent that it has spent the better part of a century being quietly archived. Gates wrote, and I am citing the original document held in the Rockefeller Foundation archive, "We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We have not to raise up from among them authors, educators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have an ample supply. The task we set before ourselves is simple. We will organize children and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way." Read that again slowly, and ask yourself what kind of adult assistant with those design specifications is optimized to produce. Not a builder of wealth, a reliable unit of labor, a sophisticated, credentialed, deeply convinced unit of labor who will, when placed in a Zurich kitchen at 3 a.m, experience the precise psychological symptoms of a person who has achieved everything and understood nothing about why financial freedom psychology was never included in the curriculum. Because the compulsory education wealth trap is not a conspiracy theory. It is a design document. And Sophia, with her MBA, her fluency in 4 languages, her instinctive ability to navigate the politics of a 14-person board, Sophia was its ideal graduate, precisely capable enough to be indispensable, precisely uncertain enough, beneath the marble in the lake view, to never seriously question the terms of her own employment. And this is where the real work begins. Not the work of earning more or optimizing more or performing the identity of success with greater conviction. The work of asking, for perhaps the first time with genuine seriousness, whose frequency am I living on? Whose definition of enough am I running toward? And is the destination, if I am honest with myself, actually mine? There is a temptation, at this point in the story, to place the blame cleanly on the education system, on Frederick Gates, on the kitchen table in Basel, and to remain there in the comfortable territory of external causes, because external causes require external solutions, and external solutions do not ask very much of us. But Sophia, standing in that kitchen at 3:17 a.m., is not asking an external question. She has already built the external answer. She is standing inside it. 1,400 square feet of Calicut marble and a lake view that cost her 11 years of 60-hour weeks, and a first marriage that ended quietly in a mediator's office in Zug, because she did not know how to be present in a room that did not require her to perform. The question she is finally, at this hour, beginning to ask is an internal one, and internal questions, as Neville Goddard understood with clarity that neither his critics nor his admirers have fully reckoned with, operate on an entirely different set of physical laws than the ones she was trained to trust. Neville Goddard wrote, in The Power of Awareness, a sentence that most readers pass through too quickly to feel its full weight. He wrote, "Your assumption, felt as true, hardens into fact. Not believed as true, not visualized as true, felt as true, with the full somatic nervous system commitment that the body reserves for things as already accepted as real." This is a Neville Goddard law of assumption, and it is not mysticism dressed in the language of ambition. It is a precise description of a neurological mechanism that Stanford University's Department of Psychiatry and Neurosciences has been mapping from the outside for the better part of 2 decades. Dr. Amy Arnson's research at Yale School of Medicine demonstrated with uncomfortable precision what chronic psychological stress does to the architecture of the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for long-range planning, abstract reasoning, and the capacity to conceive of a future that is structurally different from the present. under sustained cortisol exposure, the kind that Sophia's nervous system has been generating since a kitchen table in Basel 32 years ago. The dendritic branches of prefrontal neurons physically retract. They shorten. They withdraw. The brain, quite literally, loses the biological infrastructure required to imagine a life beyond a pattern it is already living, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. The dendrites retract, and with them, the neurological capacity for the kind of generative abundance mindset science that Wattles called the creative plane becomes physically inaccessible, not because the person is not intelligent enough, but because the instrument of access has been compromised by the very vigilance that kept them safe. This is the intersection that most conversations about wealth are too cautious or too commercially motivated to actually occupy, the place where Goddard's metaphysics and Aronson's neurobiology are not in conflict, but in precise correspondence. When Goddard instructs his reader to feel the assumption as already real, he is, in the language that neuroscience would develop 60 years later, describing a form of subconscious wealth reprogramming that works by presenting the prefrontal cortex with a sustained, emotionally credible signal of safety, of sufficiency, of a frequency in which the scarcity alarm is not running as the default operating system of the body. When the cortisol signal drops, when the nervous system is genuinely persuaded, not merely told, that the threat has passed, the dendrites, Aronson's research confirms, begin to regrow. The prefrontal cortex begins to rebuild its own architecture, and with it, the capacity for the kind of thinking, the kind of vision, the kind of manifesting abundance frequency that Sophia has never once accessed, not because she was not capable of it, but because she was never, in the truest biological sense, safe enough to inhabit it. Sophia puts her phone down on the marble counter. She does not type the question she has been circling. Instead, for the first time in longer than she can accurately remember, she does something her entire professional training has systematically discouraged. She stands still, not performing stillness, not the meditative productivity practice she read about in a business journal on a flight to Singapore, actually still, in the body, in the kitchen, with the question. And the question, when she finally allows it to form completely, is not, how do I earn more? It is not, how do I optimize what I already have? It is something older and more frightening and more honest than either of those. The question is, what would I choose? What would I actually freely choose if I were not afraid? Goddard, in The Law and the Promise, called this a state of freedom, not freedom as an outcome to be achieved, but freedom as an identity to be assumed, to operate beginning now, from the felt premise that the ground beneath you is solid, not because the external evidence confirms it, but because you have made an internal decision irrevocably to stop requiring it to. Joseph Murphy, in The Power of Your Subconscious Mind, framed the same mechanism from a different angle, arguing that the Joseph Murphy subconscious mind-money relationship is not aspirational but architectural. The subconscious does not distinguish between what is real and what is vividly, emotionally assumed to be real. It responds to frequency. It responds to the signal the body is broadcasting the hours between midnight and dawn, when no one is watching and no performance is required, and the only thing left is the truth of what you actually believe about whether you belong to abundance or are merely visiting it on a work visa. Sophia is still standing in her kitchen. The lake is still there. The marble is still there. The question is still there. And for the first time since she was 9 years old, watch her father count coins with a specific kind of care that is indistinguishable from fear. She does not move toward productivity. She does not open her laptop. She does not make a list. She breathes. And in the breathing, something in the neuroscience of money beliefs begins, almost imperceptibly, to shift the way a vast geological formation shifts, not dramatically, not visibly, but the level of its deepest structural assumption about what it is, and what it is for, and what kind of frequency it was built to carry. But here's what Sophia does not yet understand, and what you, listening to this in whatever room you are in, at whatever hour, with whatever version of her question alive in your own body, what neither of you yet understand is that the subconscious wealth frequency shift she is beginning is not the end of the trap. It is the entrance to a deeper one. When we say that the subconscious wealth frequency shift is not the end of the trap, but the entrance to a deeper one, we do not mean this as a provocation. We mean it as the most honest thing this conversation can offer you. Because here's what happens when a person like Sophia, rigorous, self-aware, genuinely committed to the interior work, begins to dismantle the scarcity mindset she has been running as her primary operating system since childhood. She starts to feel it working. The cortisol signal drops. The prefrontal architecture, as Arnson's research predicted, begins to rebuild. Decisions that previously felt impossible, the conversation she needed to have with her board, the sabbatical she had been delaying for 4 years, the relationship she knew, with great precision, was not serving either of them. These decisions began to feel not just possible, but obvious. And then, sometimes in weeks, sometimes in months, she encounters a wall she did not know existed, a resistance that is not neurological, that no amount of Goddard's law of assumption can dissolve on its own, that Wattles anticipated but named too gently for most of his readers to feel the full weight of. The wall is this. Her identity was not only encoded in her nervous system, it was encoded in her debt. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, in Skin in the Game, makes an observation that the financial freedom psychology literature almost universally avoids because it is structurally inconvenient. He argues that the most dangerous form of dependency is not the kind that feels like deprivation. It is the kind that feels like achievement, the mortgage that represents success, the lifestyle that represents arrival, the monthly obligations that are so thoroughly woven into the fabric of an identity that to question them feels not like financial analysis, but like self-destruction. Sophia's golden cage salary trap is not the Boot Hop kitchen. It is not the Lakeview. It is invisible architecture commitments, financial, psychological, social, that were built stone by stone to house a version of herself she assembled before she knew she had a choice. And now that she is beginning to understand she has a choice, she is discovering something that no one in How to Reprogram Your Mind for Wealth Space is honest enough to say clearly. The frequency shift is real. The neurological reprogramming is real. And the debt, the structural, systemic, Federal Reserve economic data confirm debt that the average high-earning professional carries as percentage of net worth, that is also real. And it does not dissolve with the cortisol. It waits. There's a protocol documented across research from Stanford's Behavioral Economics Division and consistent with Joseph Murphy's subconscious reprogramming techniques. That describes a 30-day threshold, a period during which the nervous system, given consistent and credible signals of safety, begins to stabilize a new default frequency, not permanently, not irreversibly, but measurably, and in ways that alter decision-making patterns in the domain of neuroscience and money beliefs with documented reliability. Sophia, on the morning after the kitchen, after 4 hours of the deepest sleep she has had in years, which is itself a data point worth noting, does something she has not done in 11 years of CFO-level productivity. She cancels her morning calls, not because she is unwell, not because there is a crisis, but because for the first time, she is applying her own inner economy the same principle she applies without hesitation to every organization she advises, that a system running at permanent capacity is a system with no resilience, and a system with no resilience is not a system that is succeeding. It is a system that is failing slowly enough to be mistaken for success. She opens a notebook, paper, not a screen, and she writes at the top of the first page, not a goal, not a strategy, not a metric. She writes a question. The same question Goddard would have recognized, that Jung would have called beginning of individuation, that Wattles would have called stepping onto the creative plane. Who am I when I am not performing survival? What Sophia is beginning in that notebook on that morning is not how to escape the rat race neuroscience exercise. It is not a mindset protocol. It is something older and more specific and considerably more dangerous because it requires her to look with clear eyes at the one dimension of her life that the scarcity mindset kept perfectly protected from the kind of scrutiny she applies to everything else. Not her identity, not her relationships, not her nervous system, her debt, because what the financial reprogramming documentary record consistently demonstrates, and what the Federal Reserve economic data on household debt-to-income ratios confirms with thoroughness that should alarm anyone who has been told that a high salary is the same thing as financial freedom, is that the subconscious reprogramming Sophia has begun will, within months, bring her into direct confrontation with a system that was designed with the same architectural precision as the Prussian classroom in the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, to ensure that the freedom she is reaching for remains perpetually, structurally, just beyond her grasp. Not because she is not capable of reaching it, but because the brain that is now, finally, beginning to imagine it was programmed, long before Basel, long before the MBA, long before the Lakeview, to believe at its deepest substratum that debt is not a condition. That debt is an identity. There is a question that lives beneath the one Sophia wrote in her notebook. A question that the why am I always broke no matter how hard I work search is really asking, underneath all its urgency and frustration. Not why do I not have enough money, but why, even when I do have enough money, does my brain refuse to believe it? Why does the nervous system of a person earning more in a month than her parents earned in a year still wake at 3:17 in the morning with the specific, ancient, biological alarm of someone who is one bad decision away from losing everything? The answer is not in your salary. It is not in your savings rate. It is not in your investment portfolio or your morning routine or your productivity system. The answer is in the architecture of the belief that was installed in you before you were old enough to consent to it or question it or choose differently. The belief that debt is the natural state of a person like you, that owing financially, emotionally, existentially, is simply what it means to participate in the world. This is the debt mindset, and it is not a financial condition. It is a neurological one that operates beneath the frequency shifts, beneath the Goddard assumptions, beneath the prefrontal rebuilding, at a depth that requires a different kind of excavation entirely. Sophia will spend the next chapter of her story learning exactly how that excavation works, how the brain was programmed to stay poor not by accident, not by circumstance, but by design, and more importantly, the precise neurological mechanism by which that programming can be identified, interrupted, and permanently rewritten. That is the question waiting in the next conversation. The one called, with precision that should now feel earned rather than provocative, the debt mindset, why your brain was programmed to stay poor, and how to reprogram it. Sophia is still in her kitchen. The notebook is open. The question is written. The lake is still there. And for the first time in 32 years, the silence feels less like a threat and more like the specific, terrifying, exhilarating quiet that comes just before something true is finally allowed to begin.